Hi, I'm Brianna Bowling. I'm the founder of Retreat and Learn. And today we are going to be talking about the Electoral College and learning about really, does our vote matter? I mean, if we have Electoral College and we're not the actual people voting, then really does it matter? And I'm sorry, I actually have. I'm sorry. Let's. I have it playing in the background. Actually, I'm sorry, I messed that up. But today we have Michael Maibach, and he is the founder of the. And now I don't have it because I just shut it down. So I'm going to let Michael actually introduce you about the Electoral College because I had to shut down the Learn YouTube thing. So, Michael, very nice to see you. I'm sorry about that really floundered introduction. That's pretty unusual for me. We've had all kinds of weird technical difficulties today that I don't normally have. But, we flounder through and we get through this stuff. So it is very nice to meet you. Can you give just a little bit of background about why you know anything about the Electoral College? Where did you get your background in knowing about this?
Well, when I was a freshman in college, my first semester, I had Dr. Herbert Storing from the University of Chicago. It was a course on the presidency, and he assigned us all to write an essay for or against the Electoral College. And I, like a lot of young people, said, well, I'm against it. I don't even understand it, and it's an anachronism, and why don't we just have a national popular vote? And then I did the readings on both sides, and I wrote an essay in favor of the Electoral College. And I've been writing and speaking about it as a hobby ever since. That was in the 1970s. And
Okay.
so that's how I got involved. I was a vice president of the Intel Corporation for most of my career in Silicon Valley. But when I retired, I became involved with nonprofits focused on the U.S. Constitution. I work today for a group called Save Our States. There's 6 of us. It's out of Oklahoma, saveourstates.com. And all we do is go around the country giving talks defending the Electoral College. That's our only job, the Electoral College.
That's perfect. Well, you obviously are immensely qualified to teach us about this. I think that I know about the Electoral College, but I know that, just in our brief conversation that we had a couple of weeks ago, I know I learned some things. So I'm excited to learn alongside of our viewers. Today, while we're doing this presentation, we're doing this a little bit different than we normally do things. Michael has a really great presentation that goes over the history and why we had the Electoral College. So he's going to give that presentation. If I have questions about things that I don't understand, I'm going to ask Michael the questions. And our viewers, if you guys have any questions as we're going through this, feel free to write in the comments what your questions are. And, Michael can answer them while we're going along. So with that said, I'm going to go ahead and put up your presentation.
Okay.
And we can begin.
Okay, you can see it now?
I can, and it looks great.
Thank you. So our topic is why the founders created the Electoral College. First of all, the founders studied history. Cicero, the Roman philosopher and politician, said, if you don't know history, you will always be a child. Think about it this way. These young people that are ripping down statues in our cities this summer probably didn't know 3 sentences about the people they were, whose statues they were ripping down, because knowing history about people and the imperfections of history is very helpful. Winston Churchill said, the farther you can see backward, the farther you can see forward. And this is because man's nature does not change. 600 years after Shakespeare, we're still watching his plays because the human condition doesn't change. And that's really a definition of a conservative, which is a person that thinks that man's nature is flawed, and so did the founders. The Greeks have the first recorded Western democracy of sorts. It was for the elite only, and it was in the 400s and 300s BC period. But it fell apart. And Plato, who was a son of the people running Athens at the time, wrote in his Republic. Of course, he decided rather than to be a warrior, which his parents wanted him to be, he would be a philosopher. He said that tyranny naturally arises out of democracy. His best student was Aristotle, who wrote a book called The Politics. And in that, he said, the only successful regime that'll keep people's freedom or liberty is a mixed regime. So a king, an aristocracy, and a polity. The Romans would have said Caesar, the Senate, and citizens, Roman citizens, we would say the president and the Senate and the House. So the whole idea of checks and balances started with Aristotle trying to cure the problem of democracy, which is majority rule becomes majority tyranny. Rome was a republic for almost 500 years, but then it became an empire because of the tyrannical actions of one of their Caesars, one of their leaders, who really took over that republic and made it into an empire. Now, in a very important book for the founders, it's called The Spirit of the Laws, written in 1748 by Baron de Montesquieu. He's a Frenchman. He, for 20 years, studied why city-states, democracies, republics, large and small, why they fell. And he concluded that there must be, as Aristotle did, there must be a separation of powers to protect the minority from the majority by way of systems of checks and balances. So all children used to in America know about checks and balances. Now, I doubt that a lot of K through 12 schools are teaching this anymore because they have other agendas these days than teaching some of these fundamentals. But the main point I'm trying to make is the founders' number one goal was not majority rule. It was the rights of the minority. They did not want tyranny. They had that from the king already and the British, and they had plenty of it. So they chose to have Republican government. We're not a democracy, we're a democratic republic. In other words, we're a republic with lots of aspects that are democratic. So the whole idea of three branches of government is the checks and balances. But what Madison said was we have a compound republic. This is Federalist 51, which is we not only have checks and balances in Washington, but all of our states have governors, state legislatures, court systems themselves. So we have a compound republic of checks and balances. These founders really worried about tyranny, I promise you. So we don't have, like France or Egypt, a unitary state. We have a nation of states. Mm-hmm. So two messages so far. Minority rights are the number one goal of the founders. Number two, we have a nation of states. We don't have a unitary national government that doesn't have any subdivisions with their own power and constitutions. So in 1787, when Madison arranged for people, 12 of the 13 states to assemble with their delegates, if you will, in Philadelphia, Rhode Island refused to attend. They were the smallest state, and they were worried the big states like Virginia were going to control everything. Now, the number one problem they faced was not only regional differences. By the way, Massachusetts and Maine were all one state. West Virginia and Virginia were all one state, just so you know. So there are lots of regional differences in terms of agriculture and climate and history and even immigration trends, where people came from. But also population change or differences were huge. Virginia had the most people with 750,000 people, about the size of the District of Columbia today in terms of their population. Delaware had 59,000 people. Georgia had 75,000, which is 1/10 of Virginia. So there were 3 or 4 large states and about 8 or 9 smaller states, and they're listed here with and without slave. The red lines are slaves. Virginia had a lot of slaves, but still in terms of free citizens, it was Virginia, Pennsylvania, Philadelphia was the largest city, North Carolina, Massachusetts, New York. These were the big 5 states with population. North Carolina being because of the immigration patterns, along with Virginia, a high population. So Madison wrote in his diary when he arrived in Philadelphia, the central problem we're going to face is representation. How do you have a national government that has its own powers? And how do you represent the states and have they not feel that they're disempowered by the national government? Because the 13 states had to ratify this, and they weren't going to denude all of their powers because somebody wants to have a federal constitution. And then how do you represent people? To give you a sense of what they faced in the floor of the Constitutional Convention in Independence Hall, where these 55 men for about 3.5 months closeted themselves 5 days a week in a closed chamber without any news coverage, etc. Gunning Bedford, a delegate from Delaware, gave a speech where he begins, "I do not, gentlemen, trust you. If you possess the power, the abuse of it could not be checked. And what then would prevent you from exercising it to our destruction? You gravely allege there's no danger of combination. The larger states, you say, would be rivals of one another. This is language calculated only to amuse us. Yes, sir, the larger states will be rivals, but not against each other. They will be rivals against the rest of the states." So Madison had a real problem, which is the small states didn't want to have just total majority rule of this country, or they would not buy in. So we had the Virginia plan, the New Jersey plan, and the Great Compromise. Without going through the other plans, the Great Compromise, or the Connecticut Compromise, was struck between Roger Sherman of Connecticut, one of the small states, and James Madison. And their compromise was the following: that the U.S. House would be represented by the numbers of people in each state. As we know, that's the case today. Virginia, where I live, has 11 House members. But every state would get 2 senators, whether you're Rhode Island or Connecticut or Virginia, the biggest state. And that is the large small state compromise. And if you don't understand that, you don't understand how we got from the Articles of Confederation to the Constitution. Because without this creation of a Senate where every state has an equal voice, we would not have had the Constitution accepted, because the 9 smaller states, the 8 smaller states would have said, the large states, majority rule, they have the most people, they're going to control this union, and I want out. I'll join Canada, or I'll do something else. They also, of course, had the House and Senate, the states and the people, in constant debate, and that's how the founders wanted it. So when people complain about gridlock in Washington, D.C., the founders would say, absolutely, we want gridlock, because that's how you keep, how you avoid majority tyranny. And the founders also wanted to have leaders in their presidents. Washington was very frustrated under the Articles of Confederation. 7.5 years, he's commander-in-chief. He didn't know who to visit in Philadelphia, because every state had a delegate to the Articles of Confederation. But there was a president who was very weak, and he really had there was no American leader to lead through the Revolutionary War. And so we wanted to have, we had 3 goals to create the world's first president: majority tyranny, if we had the Congress appoint, they didn't want that; small versus large state, protect those interests of the small states; and an independent, energetic president to lead the nation. This is Federalist 68 and 70 by Hamilton. The Electoral College supports all 3 of these goals. Now, this is the only model they had, the British Parliament, and they elected their prime minister by the Parliament, or in our case, it would be the Congress. And the founders rejected that in their plans, and I won't take time to go through that. But their key questions were how to share power within the federal government, the checks and balances of 3 branches, how to share power with the states. And this is really what they debated. And in terms of how to elect the president, at the Constitutional Convention, they took 15 different votes between June and September. The Electoral College was designed the week of September 6th, the last week of the Constitutional Convention. They voted no, they didn't want to have popular election of the president. They voted no, they didn't want the Congress and popular election, national popular vote, because the large states it'd always be a Virginian or a Pennsylvanian or New Yorker. Election by Congress, no, because then the president would be ruled by the Congress, and we would have congressional tyranny. So election by the states, yes, that's how we came up with the constitutional provision called the Electoral College, was we have an election in every state, if you will. And this was James Wilson, who was an immigrant from Scotland. He was in the Continental Congress. He was a signer of the Declaration and the Constitution. Only 5 people signed them both. And he was the one that brokered that compromise in the Committee of 11. So this is our Electoral College. 50 different state capitals December 14th this year will have their electors meet and vote. We are a nation of 50 states. And just to summarize then, 13 states drafted the Declaration of Independence and approved it. That wasn't a national convention. That was a convention of the states. 12 states drafted the Constitution, and 13 approved it through ratification conventions. Over 1,600 people were involved in those ratification conventions where they voted for the Constitution. So our Constitution was created, designed, written, and created by the states. When we have confirmations of ambassadors, cabinet members, or others, it's in the U.S. Senate. In other words, the states confirm appointments by the president. And if we have an impeachment like we did this last year, which is highly unusual, who gets to decide if the president is guilty or not of an impeachable offense? Not the House. The House indicts. They're like the grand jury. But the Senate, again, the states are a key part of this country. It takes 38 states to amend the Constitution. Not a simple majority of 26. It takes 38 states. We have 50 state governors and state legislatures and state courts. The Electoral College is a state system. And by the way, if there's 3 or 4 people running for president, as happened in 1824, when they have 4 people, and nobody wins the Electoral College, the election is thrown into the House of Representatives. But guess what? Every state delegation just gets 1 vote. So Maryland just gets 1 vote. So those House members have to agree on how to vote. And if they're tied, let's say 4-4, they don't get a vote at all. So even there, the states, as a congressional delegation, elect the president. And we're not a republic, so we're not a democracy, we're a republic. A presidential veto of congressional actions is undemocratic. The filibuster in the Senate, which we're now talking about getting rid of potentially, which would be a tragedy, requires 60 votes rather than 51. We have 2 senators from California and 2 from Rhode Island. That's not, quote, democratic. And what's democratic about 9 people in robes saying that something that the elected representatives in the White House and the Congress have voted on in terms of legislation? What is democratic about the Supreme Court? Now, if we had a national popular vote, this is how our population looks. Guess what? The candidates would visit California, Texas, Florida, New York, Illinois, and maybe Ohio. And that's about it. All those little states, they would just maybe have advertisements. They would never visit. The primary system be gone, etc. So in conclusion, the Constitution, this is a Notre Dame cathedral with these flying buttresses that keep everything up so they don't have to have so many pillars inside. These are the outside pillars, if you will. If you remove one of these buttresses, the building starts to come down. If you remove the Electoral College, the rest of the Constitution will start to come down. If we had a lot more time, I would go into that. But Abraham Lincoln said, don't interfere with anything in the Constitution. That must be maintained, for it is the only safeguard of our liberties. Remember, the founders' #1 goal was not majority rule, it was minority rights, making sure everybody, even one person, this is the First Amendment, has the right to speech and to religion, etc. So with that, Brianna, if you have questions, I'd be happy to.
I have actually a really basic question. So this was a great overview of the history, why the Electoral College matters, and why it really, as a constituent and as a citizen, we want the Electoral College. I want to get down to some of the basics that I think I have a question about, and I thought I understood, but maybe I don't. So the Electoral College, who is it made up of? I mean, I think you had one slide that started talking about that, and I think, let me say what I think it is, and you tell me if I'm right or wrong.
All right.
That the Electoral College, every state gets 2, just like they get 2 senators, they get 2 representatives in the Electoral College, and then they get an additional number of representatives in the Electoral College based off of their population. Is that true?
Well, based on how many members of Congress they have. So in Virginia here, I live in Virginia, we have 2 senators, like all states do, and we have 11 House members because we have there's about 9 million people in Virginia. So we have 11 House members. Every House
in your case, you have 13 electoral.
That's right. So
Okay,
that was
so
part of
now,
the Connecticut Compromise, which is the two senators help Rhode Island have more than, let's say, one congressman.
right. Now another question. So how do people become a member of the Electoral College? How are
So
they supposed to do that?
I'm elected this year in Virginia as an elector from my party. So the way it works is every political party in every state has their own convention where they elect their electors. So there in Virginia here, there are libertarian electors standing by, there are Democrat electors standing by, and there's Republican electors standing by. All elected by the party, and maybe the Green Party, I don't know, but every party is allowed that's legally filed as a party with the state. They create their they elect their electors, their presidential electors. And then whoever wins Virginia, for example, I'm a Republican elector, it's likely that Biden will win Virginia. But if for some reason Trump wins Virginia, then I get in my car and drive to Richmond December 14th, and I will cast a vote with 12 other electors. There'll be 13 of us assembled in a room. We have an oath, we'll swear an oath, and then we will follow the voters' wishes in our state. And if Biden wins, the 13 Democrats go down there and they do the same thing, and don't get to vote. That's how it works.
Okay.
And by the way, the Constitution says we electors cannot hold any other federal office. So we can't be part of a wheeling dealing kind of a thing.
Okay, I have two questions about that. One is that you said that you've been elected you're one of the electors.
Yes.
How it's not that the citizens don't vote for you, it's actually your party that chooses you. So how are you chosen within that party to be the elector?
That's a good question. So the way we do it in Virginia is that so political parties typically are organized around congressional districts. So we have 11 congressional districts in Virginia. And so when we meet as a party, we meet in a convention of our district. These are citizens that are Republicans, and I'm in the 8th congressional district. And so last May, several months ago, last May, we had a district convention. And there were 3 of us running for elector. I was chosen among the 3. So we have 1 elected per congressional district, that's 11. And then at the state convention, which is obviously like U.S. senators statewide, they elect the 2 other electors to represent those 2 extra electors we have because we have 2 senators.
Now, you said you were elected, but who actually cast the vote for you?
There are people that are members of the Republican Party in the 8th congressional district elected me. There are they have to sign up to be a member of the convention. So they have to say that they're a member of the Republican Party, and B, they have to pay $35 to attend the convention, to pay for the hall and to vote. There were 223 of us that were members of my convention, and I called because of the COVID, rather than meeting them in person. I phoned them all and talked to them all by phone, 222 people, to ask for their votes. Well, I didn't call the 2 other candidates, and I got 98 votes out of the 200 and some. The other 2 candidates split the other 100 and some votes.
Okay, so why don't we let the citizens of that party elect the electors?
Well, every state can do it the way they want. Matter of fact, in the early days of the Republic, state legislators chose the electors rather than the party members. But very quickly, citizens demanded a voice. But any state can do it any way they want because the Constitution says each state will decide how electors are chosen. But our state legislators are not idiots. They're smart people, and they empower the people. Now, the only way we can have all the Republicans in the congressional district that I live in, for example, vote on this would be to ask them to actually register to vote for this, right? So we know who they are. It's kind of like you register to vote, in the general election or whatever. So honestly, in my congressional district, there are 750,000 citizens in total, approximately. And let's say, I don't know, 40% of them are Republicans or whatever the number would be. They all can register for all these different conventions.
Okay.
But most people are not involved in their party very much.
No, and
People
that's
would
true.
say, I'm a Democrat, but I don't go to the Democrat congressional convention.
Right.
So there's only 220 some people that cared enough to say, on a Saturday all day, well, it's a half a day, I'm going to go to this meeting, hear all the candidates speak. That's what they signed up to do. Instead, we all did it by Zoom. We did Zoom speeches and
Right.
Zoom debates. Believe it or not, we did Zoom debates among ourselves with 200 some people tuning in.
I mean, and definitely COVID has changed a lot of things, how we do things. So I think the biggest question that I think most people, when they think of the Electoral College, and the thing that kind of bugs them about it, the thing that really they want to know is that as one of the electors, if the population, the popular vote says candidate X is the winner based off the popular vote, can you vote differently than that, or do you have to vote according to popular vote?
Well, the Supreme Court just had two decisions related to this because there were two different states that had problems with electors, if you will, not wanting to vote for whoever the people. And basically, you can be fined by your state if you don't follow the voters. But in the end, it's sort of like conscientious objection. You don't have to go to the military, but we might put you in jail for a while. You can be fined. A state can fine you if you don't vote the way, but you still have the right under the Constitution to have discretion. One of the reasons that the founders originally did this, having electors, is it's part of Republican government. You and I elect members of Congress, but then they go represent us and talk among themselves, if you will, about legislation. They have committee hearings, they have debates, etc. We offload. We don't have direct democracy where you and I and the viewers here vote for every law. We just don't have that.
Right.
No country in the world that I know of does that, right? Instead, we have representatives vote for us. Well, that's in the Electoral College is sort of in keeping with that, which is, so think about the process right now. My fellow Republicans, when I called 220 people and said, please vote for me for elector, everybody just asked one question. They pretty much knew who I was. I've lived here 23 years here in Alexandria. I was a pretty well-known guy, if you will, among my fellow party members. Not famous, but we know each other.
Sure.
They just said, just assure me that when you get to Richmond, if the Republican wins, which happens to be Mr. Trump, you will not vote for John Kasich or Mitt Romney or do something theatrical. They just want you to know that you're going to be loyal. Right. And of course, I'm going to be loyal. And honestly, the biggest check on me is if I went to Richmond and didn't vote for Mr. Trump, but let's say, I voted for, I don't know, Franklin Roosevelt, let's pick on Mitt Romney because he's sort of a rebel in our party, et cetera, which is fine. I like Mitt. I voted for him for president. Guess what? 220 people would never trust me again and probably never talk to me again.
No, that's true.
If you really want to lose all your friends and people say, that guy lied to us. He said he was going to represent us, right? But they can't throw me out of office, but they can't throw me out of their backyard and say, you're not invited to the barbecue. And nobody wants to be ostracized. I
like your description and your explanation and kind of the analogy of comparing it to the House of Representatives, and that we elect these people to vote for us. And if they don't, then we get rid of them.
And there's a little bit more to this, of course, there always is. In 1787, there was no internet. There was no New York Times. People pretty much never left their state in their whole life. And most people were farmers, and they weren't well informed of the issues of the day. There were newspapers, very partisan newspapers by and large. But the electors were typically people that were more, what would you call, sort of successful and engaged citizens.
Right.
Like a James Madison, who, or I don't know, Ben Franklin, who were outstanding citizens. And so they say, well, I don't even know that fella from New York who's running for president, but I trust Michael, or I trust Mary. Well, in those days it was just men. I trust Michael or John or Robert, that they're going to, they're in effect endorsing that person. And by the way, they'll know before I will if that person between election and electoral college voting has died of a heart attack. They probably will know that news. You see, one of the things is we elect a president, and then we have from November 3rd, we'll have until December 14th. So it's 5 weeks. We'll have, what if something happens in 5 weeks? What if Trump or Biden has their airplane crashes? Well, then the electors can say, we're going to have to do something else here, Mike Pence or Kamala Harris, et cetera. So it was sort of a fail-safe system on breaking news. People's life expectancy was maybe 38, 40 years. And so people were dying of stuff. 70% of people that died in those days died from infections.
Right.
They cut their hand on an axe, and 3 days later they're dead. George Washington died because he had a throat infection. Today, he'd take an antibiotic, but they couldn't cure him, and so he died of an infection in the throat.
Right.
So people died a lot more quickly than sitting in the hospital for months.
Michael, we actually have a couple of questions from our audience. I was going to ask you a couple of them here. The first question was the original Electoral College comprised of Democrats, Republicans, and liberals?
The original Electoral College, well, when Washington ran, he was unopposed. And so 100% of the electors voted for Washington. He was in effect in the Federalist Party, I guess you would say. But when the party system started really with Jefferson. Jefferson and Madison had a falling out with Washington and Hamilton. Matter of fact, after a certain period, Washington never again spoke to James Madison because he felt that he had betrayed him, which he did. He and Jefferson went to Pennsylvania and started opposition newspapers against George Washington, etc. That's a longer story. But in the election of 1800, when Jefferson, his party was called Republican Party. It was later called the Democratic Republican Party because the French Revolution gave democracy a bad name, and the Democrat moniker on that party was a term of derision. Just like the Methodist Church is Methodist because John Wesley was very methodical, and so that was a term of derision to call somebody a Methodist and the Methodist Church. So anyway, the electors were from the two parties, but from the legislature. But there always are party electors, but the only one that goes to the state capitol to vote is whoever wins that state.
Okay. All right. We have two more questions, and they're coming in again. So we're going to move on to this next one. It's a little bit changing paths a little bit. As a representative for the Electoral College, so yourself, what do you do, and other electors, I'm going to add that part to it, to promote national public awareness of the election? When does that happen, and how often? And then I'm going to actually ask you to answer this first question first. How long is your term?
Oh, well, it is a public office. It's a constitutional office. And my term is until December 14th.
And how long is the whole term? When did you start and when do you end?
Oh, I was elected in May, certified in probably June. But this is a very temporary public office. It's just until the Electoral College meets.
So it's just one election cycle. So it's not like you have a 4-year term and multiple times.
It's not a sinecure. It's a one. And so if I wanted to be elector 4 years from now, I have to run again, and then I serve for a few months and then out. And by the way, I probably no elector. There's 500 and trying to think now with 535 electors, but there's more. There's a few more because of a couple extras, but I'm probably the only elector giving speeches around the country for the Electoral College. It happens to be my job. My day job is to working for Save Our States, giving speeches. But this is not what I do. Is not a requirement of being an elector. Electors mostly get elected and then sit around waiting for the election to happen to see if they need to drive to the state capitol. Maybe they'll talk to the Rotary Club or something.
Right.
But I have a speech tonight at Williams College through Zoom. So I do these all the time.
Yeah, I think that you're probably a fairly unusual elector.
Completely unusual. Yeah.
Okay. And the next question actually is it's getting back to that first question that I asked that I thought was probably the most pressing thing on people's mind, and is often on election day, media reports who won the Electoral College prior to me getting to the voting booth. So does my vote really count?
Well, it's a good question. I think what they're really saying is that enough states, through exit polls, they do polling while people are voting, while they're walking in, how are you going to vote? And they try to do this algorithm where they figure out, okay, New York is going to go for X, and Maine's going to go for Y, etc. And they will then extrapolate. I think the news media has learned some lessons from this, especially in 2000, when the news media said Gore had won, and then there was a contested election in Florida, and Gore didn't win. And so the news media now is much more careful about predicting who's going to win and at what point. I think it's not responsible that they do that. They ought to let all the polls close before they announce any state. So they shouldn't announce Virginia until 7 p.m. or 8 p.m. whenever we close our polls. And then they can keep announcing states as they come in, but I don't think they should declare anybody a winner. This year will be especially drawn out. I don't think we'll have a winner maybe for the first week or two. It could be much longer. It could go to the Supreme Court. This mail-in voting is going to involve lots of litigation. Now, the key is going to be, if this is a blowout, if Biden wins overwhelmingly and lots of states come in, and there's no hope that Trump could have a recount or something, then we'll know very quickly if Biden wins or not. The alternative, I think, is that that Trump and Biden are in close race in several states: Minnesota, Michigan, Wisconsin, North Carolina, Florida, Arizona, Nevada. Those seem to be this time swing states. And by the way, we can talk about swing states. They change all the time. But those are the swing states this year based on the polls. If those are very close, campaigns can demand recounts legally. And those recounts, remember the hanging chads and all that in Florida in 2000. My gosh, this could take days and days and weeks, and it could even be litigated sometimes in the Supreme Court. So some states are saying that you have to have, Oregon says you have to have a mail-in vote back into us by October 15th, other states by election day. And the Supreme Court of one state just said the state government wanted to give them 3 or 4 days after election day to have their mail-in ballots. And they said, no, it has to be election day. There's lots of things to litigate. There's armies of lawyers amassing in some of these states, ready to sue on both sides. So prepare for litigation. Just no matter what, there's reasons to vote, even if you think, well, my state is California and it's going to go for Biden and I'm for Trump, so why vote? Well, there's governor, there's congressman, there's U.S. senator, there's the state and local elections, there's referendums, etc. Colorado has a statewide referendum repealing. It's November 3rd. It would repeal, if it's adopted with a no vote, repealing the National Popular Vote Compact that the state legislature and governor signed on behalf of the people of Colorado. There's 15 states that have passed that NPV, the National Popular Vote Compact, and Nevada and people in Colorado got up signatures, and they're going to vote maybe to get rid of that. So there's lots of reasons to vote in addition to the presidential.
So you actually said something pretty important at the beginning of that, and that, in terms of the media, and, the media is saying who the Electoral College voted for. It's actually not reporting who they voted for. It's the prediction of who they're going to vote for.
Absolutely.
Correct?
Yeah.
So with that, that kind of falls off another question that I had never thought about is that, so the election occurs, everybody puts in their votes. We know what the popular vote is eventually. When exactly, what is the date that the Electoral College actually meets and casts their vote?
This year's December 14th. I think it's the second Tuesday after the first Monday of December. I'll have to check that, but we have by our Constitution, we have the national election the first Tuesday after the first Monday of November. And that's how these things are set. The reason we have November elections is because the crops are already in.
Right. So, all right. So going back to that, let's assume that there's a lot of muddied waters. We're not really actually sure who the popular vote is. There's some discrepancy. And then still on December 14th, there's discrepancy is still occurring. Does the Electoral College vote get delayed until that is confirmed? Or does you go ahead and vote and then re-vote?
That's a very good question. I don't know that it's ever, I'm going to make a note. I don't know that it's ever been delayed. In the Florida thing, the Supreme Court ruled before the electors met.
Okay. All right. So
I don't think in our history it's
never happened.
But we've only had 5 problematic elections. In 1824, there were 4 candidates, and Andrew Jackson got the most votes, but he only got like 38% of the vote or something like that. Nobody, of course, rarely do we have anybody win 51% of the vote. You know that.
Right.
Most of our presidents have been minority presidents. So, for example, Abraham Lincoln. So, on 1824, it went to the House of Representatives, and they chose John Quincy Adams because Henry Clay did a deal with John Quincy Adams, et cetera. But then in 1876, there was a lot of problems with elections, the right to vote. Black people had been enfranchised, et cetera. So there's actually a congressional commission to deal with that. And there was a congressional agreement on the winner in 1876 called the Compromise of 1876 for Hayes rather than Tilden. And part of that agreement apparently was that Northern troops would be withdrawn. This was a Civil War thing, withdrawn from the South, et cetera. And then anyway, but the main ones have been 2000 Bush v. Gore was very close election.
Yes.
Florida elected. And then the Trump thing, which was Mrs. Clinton got 2.5 million more votes than Trump. But Trump beat her in the Electoral College. He won 30 states. She won 20 states. By the way, Bush won 30 states in 2000 and Gore won 20. Okay. 9 states have half of our population. So that's one of the challenges here. But if in 2016, if you remove the California voters, both for Trump and for Clinton, Trump won the national popular vote. It was really the state of California with 40 million people, all those Democrats, there's a lot of Democrats, millions, that made the difference. And that's why the Electoral College is an alternative to having just a few states select every president. Remember,
No, that's a perfect example. I mean, in that situation, California would have chosen our president in one single state, or not really one single state, but had a very strong influence.
Well,
that would have been a good thing.
If we had a national popular vote, there are 20 cities that have 40% of our population, metro areas. Los Angeles County has more people than 41 states.
That's amazing.
New York City has more people than 39 of our states.
Okay.
Nassau County, which is one of the 3 counties on Long Island, is not part of New York City. Nassau County has more people, 1.5 million, than 10 of our states.
Okay. One county.
So if we had a national popular vote, there'd be no political party. There'd be the Democrats and Republicans would be a thing of the past. There'd be lots and lots of parties. And somebody like Mark Zuckerberg could say, you know what? I'm a billionaire 40 times over, whatever. I'll just campaign in New York, Chicago, Miami, Houston, Seattle, San Francisco, LA, and the rest I'll just do with advertisements and Facebook ads and stuff. And I won't need to visit very many states anymore.
Right.
And guess what? All the people, all those farmers that need land instead of people to feed those cities, they'd be serfs. And those serfs would want to be in a republic where only the cities elect people. So,
all right. That's a really good recap. And I think that definitely clearly explains why the Electoral College matters. And so I think we're going to end there. And I appreciate all of the knowledge you've given us. It's been, I really honestly thought going into this that I understood the Electoral College. I've learned a lot. So I appreciate your time and your expertise. And so thanks very much.
Thanks for having me, Brianna.
All right. Thanks everybody for listening in and asking your questions. They were great.